is Eric Peters of epautos.com. Articles, very witty, very insightful. He's known what's happening with this stuff from the very beginning, and he and I share want to be able to move instead of being locked into a tiny cell and given a VR headset. I mean, this kind of stuff it's coming, and we've been talking about this stuff coming for the longest time. But I want to begin. I don't usually talk about the weather unless it has some big consequences. But there was some big consequences that came out of the snowstorm. Article about that, the lessons of I-95. What are the lessons of I-95, Eric? Thank you for joining us.
Well, some new consequences. We've always known that when a sudden, unexpected snowstorm hits, sometimes you get stuck in the snow. What differs this time is that we've got this electric car boondoggle thing to contend with, and the reason we've got to how they're going to contend with it is that on heat real fast, and the problem with generating heat with electricity is it's extremely inefficient, as anybody who has a baseboard heater system in their home will know. Those things suck down a lot of juice.
Yes.
And if you did not plan for this sudden unexpected snowstorm, and how are you going to do that, and hadn't gotten fully charged before you left your house, and let's say you assume 75 miles of range left on my battery, and now you find yourself in the middle of the interstate, you got a problem.
That's right. And you had the governor there, Governor Kuhnman, was throwing shade on all the people who said, well, you should have known better. And one of them, of course, was Senator Tim Kaine, who was a running mate of Hillary Clinton, who got stuck for nearly 30 hours. It's 27 hours or something like that. But a lot of people were stuck that way. And I know how that happens. My family and I, back in, it was 2000. Because they were still fighting over the hanging chads and stuff. And we took a trip up to New York, and they've had bigger snowstorms up there, but they had the most snow that happened within a 24-hour period, just dumped all of a sudden and caught everybody off guard. And so we had a car that had four-wheel drive. It was 30, and cars over there that didn't have four-wheel drive. They were stuck in the lot, and the snow would be up over the bumper, in some cases up over the headlights, but it just kept plowing through. But then I couldn't get out anywhere where the got stuck in that particular Thanksgiving snowstorm for over 30 hours. You had school kids who were trying to get home. It happened so quickly. They wound up spending the Thanksgiving weekend in a fast food place to try to stay warm. But, you had places around there, whereas on the interstate, you don't have places like that. And so I understand how that happens, how it can happen very quickly. But, what you said about electric cars is even truer when you look at what is going on. They're forcing everybody in New York. They're banning natural gas and other things like that people could use for heat. They're going to force everybody into electric space heaters, electric HVAC, which is not as efficient. At the same time, they're burdening the power grid by pushing everybody to electric cars. So they're strangling the power generation source. At the same time, they are dumping a huge amount of, other burden on the. It is a program.
Yeah, it all represents a regression in mobility, ultimately, and in flexibility. Let's say you get stuck again in your gas-powered car. Well, when the snow melts and the plows come, you can move. Now, if the electric car ran out of juice, it's bricked, and now you've got 2 tons plus of electric car clogging up the freeway, and it won't move again. How are you going to bring a can of kilowatt hours to your dead electric car to get it going again?
They'll be running long extension cords, right?
It's astonishing that people are. I mean, to me, it's as striking. And try to draw a parallel here, if this makes any sense. It's as striking to me as the insouciance with which so many people view and think about the fact that just about every day now we have a case percolating upward of a healthy young athlete keeling over of myocarditis. Nothing to see here. That's okay. Right. No, that somehow that doesn't trigger red flags in people. And it's the same thing with these electric cars. All of these diminutions, these regressions, these increases in costs, everything that's negative somehow is just kind of shoved off the table, and we're supposed to focus on all these putative benefits that are at best ephemeral for most people.
And that's what we saw with the Consumer Electronics Show. You've got Sony jumping in. We've been told, Apple for years, we told they had an Apple car that was coming out, and it wasn't. And then they've been keeping this going, and now they're going to jump back in. So you got consumer electronics companies like Sony and like Apple and all the rest of them are jumping in because they've turned the car basically into a consumer electronics device because they want to surveil us and to control our transportation. That's the way they sell the clean, emission-free car, as they like to portray it. Mm-hmm. And of course, we know that's not true. We've talked about how, you've got the power generation's got to happen somewhere. And and then you have to have the rare earth minerals that are going to put this together. But they put it out there as this, immaculate conception of a piece of equipment. And yet the real thing that they're pushing is the autonomous control and surveillance that comes with it, isn't it?
Yeah, there's also kind of an apples and oranges thing here in that a cell phone is a relatively inexpensive, disposable consumer appliance. So it's not that big a deal to trade out your cell phone every 2 years or so for another one, right? I mean, leaving aside the Orwellian and the big brother aspects of it, from an economic or financial point of view, it's not crazy. But a car isn't a cell phone. You're talking about something that last year transacted for $35,000 on average. Mm-hmm. And it's not something that most people can afford to just toss every several years to get another one. That's one of the humongous issues behind this whole electric car phenomenon that nobody wants to talk about. It, irrespective of whether you agree or disagree with climate change and how wonderful electric cars are, at the end of the day, most people simply cannot afford to spend $40,000 and up on a car, whether it's electric or not.
That's right. And then what happens in a few years is, I think you pointed out, with the battery, when the batteries break, when that happens to your phone or your laptop, you get another one. But when that happens to your electric car, what do? Because we're seeing real incomes declining significantly. And I think that's another aspect. Because ultimately, Eric, they want to make sure that they don't have any private cars. And they've even said that. They don't want to have private cars. You're not going to have a private car even with your electric car. They're going to price you out of it, and they're going to push it out of the marketplace. If you have it, if you're very wealthy and you can afford to have it, they're going to control it in terms of how it is driven. That's the agenda.
Yet,
it's not about the emissions.
They're becoming quite open about that now.
Yeah.
They're saying it. They're using that terminology very openly. I wrote an article the other day that touched on this whole business of instead of selling cars, they're going to sell you transportation or mobility as a service, because they know perfectly well that this is not sustainable, leaving aside the politics of it, that most people are not going to be able to buy, say, a $40,000 electric car and then 6 or 7 years later spend $5,000 on a battery for their now massively depreciated electric car. So what's the solution to that? Well, it's to get you on the serial payment plan. So, instead of owning a car, you'll just continue to pay in perpetuity for the option to use their electric car, or whatever they're going to try and cram down your throat.
That's right. Yeah, it's been a progression on this, and we've talked about how they're making the cars more and more expensive, the time frame for you having to pay it, 6 years, 7 years, 8 years or whatever, because they know that you can't really afford to do it. And then it's going to be, then they can make more money out of the lease, but then they can lease it to you by the hour. And that's really where they want to go, because the monopoly mindset of all these people is that they don't want anybody to own anything except them. And they want to turn all of us into renters, whatever we're talking about. And, Eric, this goes back to Robert McNamara. When he left the Pentagon, he went to work for the World Bank. Everybody was accusing him of setting up a rent-seeking trap with the World Bank. They said, you are not financing infrastructure to help people with their economy. Instead, what you were telling them, you're giving them money and telling them to set up welfare programs, and you're just turning all these developing, quote-unquote, developing countries, you're not developing anything other than a welfare. Doing with us, with this universal basic income, taking our jobs, and the vaccine and the mandates are just a beard to usher that in, aren't they?
Sure. Yeah, it's a kind of digital serfdom.
Yes.
It's not just that you will own nothing; you won't even possess it. You won't even have the tangible thing in your hand. It's very ephemeral. I use an example in my article that I wrote about this topic to relate Hulu and Netflix and these other services where rather than, say, owning the DVD and now it's yours, you pay a fee to watch the thing and then it disappears and that's it.
Exactly. Yeah, we used to have video rental stores back in the 1980s. And we could see what Hollywood is wanting to do with they called it pay per view, right? Not paper, but pay per view. And they wanted to do a streaming service and everything. They did not want to have anybody owning anything and renting it out. They opposed the video cassette rental market from the very beginning. They lost in the Supreme Court. So for a few years, they played along, and it was the best economic situation that Hollywood ever had. But they are so driven to everybody into renters that they basically killed that golden goose by moving windows around and that type of thing. That's their mindset. It's always going to be the only one who's going to own anything, and everybody's going to rent from me. And that is written large all over the UN 2030 agenda, all over the Great Reset agenda, isn't it?
Yeah, isn't it interesting, the question begging? You hear that phrase about how you will own. So, okay, well, if we own nothing, then who will own everything?
That's right. Or who will manufacture anything? You've got an article about those chips. Yeah, talk a little bit about those chips and about the shortages that are coming up here, the supply chain.
Well, okay, yeah, this whole thing with the new car supply chain problem as it pertains to cars, part of it has to do with the shortage of these chips, meaning semiconductor chips that are integral to all of the computers, plural, not just one, that operate the systems in all modern cars. And it's become very difficult to assemble these essentially 2-ton cell phones without all of these chips. And a source I've got within the business has told me that they're so desperate to get these vehicles off the line and into showrooms that now they're using non-specific parts rather than the specified ones to get the things out on the road, on the truck, and into the showrooms, which is fine in terms of it makes the vehicle work. But here's the catch. The catch. When the thing fails and you need a particular part number according to whatever the book says, and they use something different, now you've got this conundrum of not being able to fix the thing anymore because that particular part wasn't the correct one, or the correct one's no longer available because they jimmied it together just to try to get it out there and get it sold.
Wow. It's really going to make things complicated. You're going to go to, you're going to have a problem with your car, and they're going to have to look it up and say, well, is this variant A, B, C, D, E, F, G, because we change this like every couple of weeks or every month or so.
Well,
we're going to have a different.
Have this information.
Yeah.
You remember, you and I are old enough to remember when there was a lot of interchange between physical parts because they really weren't necessarily electronic. And even across makes and models, you could find something like a coil or a distributor or some part that fit and worked on, say, a Ford, but would also work on a Chevy or a Chrysler. And there were manuals that cross-referenced the various part numbers, and you could figure out what worked. And if it wasn't available from the traditional source, well, you could source it from this other source, and you'd be good to go and get back on the road. That sort of thing is becoming increasingly difficult, if not impossible.
That's right. Yeah, one of the first things you and I ever talked about was this Millennium Digital Copyright Act, or Digital Millennium Copyright Act. I don't remember, but it was in the context of General Motors, but specifically John Deere, prohibiting farmers who are, they survive by putting things together, jerry-rigging with some Bailey wire or whatever, to get their mechanical stuff going. As a farmer, you don't have a lot of cash, but you do things on your own to make it work. So they didn't want that to happen. They didn't even want to have a third party that was going to be able to go in there and swap out a component. Because they would brick your device. And so they were basically stopping all repair with that. And now they've taken it to the next step at Consumer Electronics Show. I talked about it yesterday, the fact that John Deere is bragging about how they're going to, they got autonomous, tractors, and they're going to get rid of the farmers driving the tractor and so forth. And it just creates more and more dependency, more and more complexity at the time where our supply chains are melting down. And, Eric, they were just talking about suggesting that for Taiwan, what they should do is declare that since they've got some particular categories, they have the largest silicon foundries anywhere in the world, and so much of the world is dependent on them for electronic components. They should say, well, this is our defense program. If you attack us, we blow this up. Can you imagine what that's going to do to the world if if that happens, I mean, it's going to be across everything if that were to happen.
Well, with regard to deer and what these car companies are doing that's of a piece, the part that's particularly insufferable to me and obnoxious is you have the fiction of ownership in that you go in there and you ostensibly are purchasing this item, whether it's a car or a tractor. You have title to this thing. You pay the property taxes if those are applicable. So, you have this fiction of ownership, but what do you own when the thing that makes it work, the software, the company that built the thing continues to assert indefinite ownership over that, which gives them functional control over that item for the duration of its service life.
That's right. And that was one of the things that happened when they lost at the Supreme Court, the Hollywood people. They tried to say, well, you can buy this cassette, but we're not going to let you rent it. And then they lost in the Supreme Court. And then they came back, and there was a company, I think it's called Clean Features. For decades, they've been fought by Hollywood. And I don't know what the current status is right now. But what they decided they would do is after you bought a DVD, for example, they didn't do it with the cassettes, but with a DVD, they could reprogram, the player, and they could branch around certain types of scenes. So if you wanted to watch stuff with your family, you wanted to cut out particular violent scenes or language or sex scenes or whatever, they create a database on a movie by movie basis, and so you could download their controls into your player and branch around it. So you could take something that was an R-rated film and you could turn it into an airline version, for example, to watch with your family. Hollywood hated that. And they fought and back and forth and to maintain control of something that they had sold to people a long time ago. So again, it goes back the same mentality from these people. We're going to not only own everything, but we're going to tell you what you can do with it forever, even if you buy it.
Exactly. So, it's serial debt in the first place.
Yep.
And in the second place, it's perpetual ownership, which means perpetual control. We're being enserfed. We're being reduced to this status where